Welcome to the Kaleidoscope of Possibilities, Alternative Perspectives on Mental Health. My name is Dr. Adriana Popescu. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and leader in the field of mental health, energy psychology, addiction, trauma, and empowerment. In this podcast, we will be exploring mental health from a variety of perspectives, from the spiritual to the shamanic and beyond. What if mental illness isn't everything we think it is? What if everything we see as a pathology is actually a possibility? What else is possible with mental health? Hi, everyone. Dr. Adriana Popescu with you today with another episode of Kaleidoscope of Possibilities, Alternative Perspectives on Mental Health. I'm really excited today to have with me Dr. Craig Weiner. He has spent over 35 years working in the healthcare field. He is a director of the EFT Tapping Training Institute and currently serves as chair of the board of trustees for EFT International. He is a certified and accredited advanced EFT practitioner, mentor, and EFT master trainer of trainers. In addition, he is a trainer of Matrix Reimprinting and a founder of the Tapping Out of Trauma continuing education seminars, of which I can highly recommend myself, having taken them. Along with his wife, Alina Frank, they co-produced the film The Science of Tapping and are the creators of the podcast EFT Nation. He is profoundly interested in the underlying emotional and physical connections that stem from adversity and trauma, as well as the facilitation of the transformation of trauma into post-resilience and post-traumatic growth. More information can be found at efttappingtraining.com. Welcome, Craig.
Hey, great to be here, Adriana.
Yes,
I've been looking forward to this one.
I know, me too. You've been on my list for a long time, actually, because I did as a psychologist who learned about tapping many, many years ago. I believe I was at the, second or third ACEP conference back in 2000.
Wow.
And
wow.
was first introduced to EFT and all kinds of energy psychology techniques. And it just profoundly altered the course of my own life and my professional life as well. So I'm really excited to now be sharing all of this information with the world in these wonderful ways, like through podcasts and videos and YouTube and social media and all.
No, thank you for doing it and getting the word out there. It's wonderful.
Yeah. So I'd love to start, as I do every episode, with finding out more about our guest. Tell us about yourself, how you came to do this kind of work.
So I came through the more somatic world, right? I was interested. Young 20s, landed in Berkeley, and just got involved in body work and hands-on manual and somatic work, and ended up going to chiropractic school, and I've been a chiropractor for over 30 years. But there's always been that intrigue of the mind, body, spirit, energy connection, more holistic, complementary approach. And so, as a chiropractor, I've always been, had educational programs and guest speakers. So I've always been interested in all different kinds of healing, probably just like you. Specifically with regard to this work, about 12 years ago, I heard about this EFT tapping. And to be honest, when I first heard about it, it was actually through Joe Mercola's website back in the day. And I thought it was a bunch of BS. There's no one thing, and there's no, I get approached all the time from people with modalities and vitamins and nutritions that do everything. And I was like, yeah, one more thing that does everything for everybody and whatever. Okay, not interested. And so I was skeptical at the beginning, tapping on the face and this, that. It's like, I thought it was kind of ridiculous. And I was pretty open-minded about lots of alternative healing, but for whatever reason at the time, it just felt like it wasn't legit. So now look at me, right? So I say, you know what? When anybody says, oh, they're so skeptical, I'm like, don't worry, they may end up being like a professor in tapping, right? So whatever. So what I want to say is, an opportunity came to present something different at my clinic, and I said, that wasn't fair. I really didn't know what that was, and I didn't give it a fair shake or look at. And so I started reading some of the research, which intrigued me, and I live on a rural island, Whidbey Island in Washington off the coast of Seattle. And I looked at anybody around here do this, and there was one person that did. I invited them to the office, we spoke, did a demonstration. I'm like, okay, this is really interesting. I'm starting to get more interested in here. Changed the course of my life. We ended up getting married, and we teach and train together. And, so Alina's my wife, and she was the one that really introduced me. And I brought more of the science background. I was a little bit more critical thinking with regard to, but how does this work, and how can this be doing what's the mechanism of action here? And but I guess the point is that while I was skeptical, when I started to look at how does this thing possibly affect health conditions, physical health conditions, mental health conditions, phobias, addictions, physical pain. And I started to look at, well, the one thing that all of them had in common. And the one thing that all of them had in common was a stress response to whatever that object was. And so if I started to look at, if we can reduce the stress response to whatever you point that cone of light at, whatever you pointed at, then maybe it can have an effect on my relationship to that thing. Whether it be to that trauma, that difficult relationship, that work stress, whatever it is. And so I started to have a lens to be able to see it through a possibility of how that might be altering my relationship to that. My future worry about something, my past stress or traumatic response to that. And so that's literally what I started to understand and have a lens to look at it through, and then started to have my own experience with it personally, and then started to have the responses. I learned how to do it with clients over time after training, and one thing has led to another, and here I am, doing what I do. So that's where I started. Sometimes I see a lot, people come to EFT for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's their therapist did it with them. Maybe they read a book or they were online. Some people found it because of their own healing. Some people are healthcare practitioners that are looking at non-pharmaceutical ways of working with different conditions. So people find EFT in their own way. And it's just my mission to make sure that the experiences they have are solid and valid, and working with practitioners that are well trained, and just keeping up the standards for that. Yeah. So like that.
Wonderful. Yes. I came actually to this work through my own health issues. I was at the time that I discovered energy psychology, and like we were talking about before, went to my first conference of the energy psychology folks, the ACEP, the Association for Comprehensive Energy Psychology. I was really, really sick at the time with what turned out to be Lyme disease and chronic fatigue syndrome. And Western medicine, because I was also so deep into it at that point, I wasn't even 13. It was 13 years before I even got a correct diagnosis. So Western medicine really had nothing for me, and I had to seek alternative therapies. And so I started with chiropractic, acupuncture. My acupuncturist then introduced me to something called NET, neuroemotional technique, which similarly is working with the meridian system in the body, was also developed by a chiropractor. And that really made a difference. And what I noticed was, as I started, working through my own unresolved traumas from my childhood and my own stress, because I'm also a student in grad school at this time, right? So super stressed out all the time, in a difficult relationship, all the things. And so I noticed that when I would have those treatments, I would feel better. And then the herbs and the homeopathy and the other things we were doing to heal the Lyme disease would become more effective. So when I went to my first ACEP conference and learned tapping, I already knew there was value in this because of the work I had been, started doing. So, but back then we talked about it really differently. Like it really was more the Eastern kind of approach of what we knew from 5,000 years of Chinese medicine. So could you tell us a little bit about the traditional kind of perspective on stimulating acupuncture points to create shifts in the energy flow in the body?
Yeah, I would say because where EFT came out of historically drew from its origins prior to that from thought field therapy, which is the work of Roger Callahan and Dr. Diamond. And so when we started to look at its foundation, of course, the foundations go back much thousands of years, because what that work was doing was combining for the first time, combining in the way that it was, the look through a Chinese medicine perspective of the different points in the body that were sensitive. We're starting to have a lot more evidence about the physical nature of what these actually points are in the body, starting to actually see dye-related concentration points in these acupoints in the body. So it's becoming much more validated than people even thought it was. prior to these anatomical structures that are running through the body. But it was often spoken through an energetic lens and through a meridian Chinese medicine lens. And so Dr. Callahan started noticing that when he was employing his interest in Chinese medicine and the meridian endpoints, that combined with the stimulation of the points, not through needles, but through finger pressure stimulation, mechanosensory pressure. When he would do that, combined with different things that he was having people tune into with their thoughts and emotions and feelings and beliefs about things, that he was getting amazing results. Mm-hmm. And so we draw from the lineage that we come from, right? We draw from thousands of years of Chinese medicine, and we use with the tapping and the stimulation. So there is, when we stimulate through this tapping, there's a piezoelectric effect. In other words, there's a transduction of a change from mechanical pressure into electrical stimulation that causes nerve transduction of being able to send nerve signals through that then affect the brain, which then affect our autonomic nervous system. So it really is a whole body approach. And when we are tuning into thoughts and feelings and, you know, felt sense of how we're experiencing about some topic, we can start to look at the real changes physiologically that are happening in the bodies we're doing this. So we've now had, I think there are 5 functional MRI studies that have been published. We're starting to look, you know, we've seen multiple studies of significant changes in cortisol production that happen as a result of tapping within a short period of time. We see brainwave changes. So we're looking at this whole body approach at how, as we tune in and focus on something, and simultaneously, we're creating like a kind of a counter conditioning. We're creating, at the same time that we're tuning into something stressful, we're also simultaneously tuning into something that through amygdala deactivation, et cetera, we're starting to get a decreased stress response that then is tied to what normally is a stress target. And we start to shift or, you know, rewire in a not technical sense, but in other words, we're rewiring our relationship to that object, to that thing that normally causes us to move into a fight or flight sympathetic response, typically. And so now I all of a sudden think about that, and it just feels kind of detached. It feels kind of neutral. That thing that I have a phobic response to, or whatever that is like, I don't know, kind of is what it is. And I'm not feeling it in my body, and I'm not thinking those same thoughts, and I'm not having those same emotions. So it starts changing in a real mind-body approach to different conditions and habits and patterns that people have developed over time.
Yeah. And because I pretty quickly, because I was, you know, a student in grad school, and I wanted to apply these tools that I was learning, you know, to my clients, and was very fortunate to have, within limits, you know, supervisors who allowed me to do some of that work. I really found that it really does create change for people. But when I would try to explain the mechanism of how it works before we had all this kind of science data now that we do, it was hard, and it was a hard sell. People thought,
yes,
woo woo, we, I mean, I'm even in California, and people still thought, woo woo, weird. I don't know what that is. This feels stupid. I don't want to do that. And there was a lot more resistance, you know, 20 years ago, I noticed.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, things change slowly, right? And we start to look at over, you know, 25 years or so now, people have started to hear a lot more about it. The research has supported it. I see, you know, in our trainings now, probably a solid third, maybe even sometimes up to half of the students in the class are social workers, psychologists, LMHCs, et cetera. And so we're seeing this validated, and then the research people go, oh, well, you need some research for them. Like, clearly you haven't looked, because clearly we have over 150 published studies. We've got, I think, 60 randomized controlled trials. We've got at least 3 meta-analyses, you know, for the effectiveness of PTSD for depression and anxiety and PTSD, growing evidence for physical pain. So, I mean, these things, it has a much stronger body of evidence. Not saying it doesn't need more, not saying it doesn't need larger clinical studies and more publications, because we do. But it's not willy-nilly, and it's not minimal either. It's more than actually many types of psychotherapeutic interventions that have much lesser volume of research. So
And the results, the just statistical results are more powerful than antidepressants and some of the medications that, they're basically realizing. I don't know. I've seen or heard of studies where it's like primarily placebo effect. It's not actual, effect sizes. There's, anyways, I'm not going to debate like the whole medication thing because I think
Right.
medications have their place in all of this.
Exactly.
But
Sure.
people take it for granted that because the medical establishment says that these things work and that they're helpful, therefore people take them, and people don't do their research and they don't realize
Yeah.
there's a huge body of evidence. So I often will cite this, and, if you want to talk about it, that Harvard Medical School research study.
Okay, so yeah, so David Feinstein speaks a lot about this. I want to have a caveat with it is people sometimes will use that study as an EFT study. It's not an EFT study. It was actually an acupuncture study,
Yeah.
right? And so it's an acupuncture study that strongly showed that the stimulation of certain acupoints decrease amygdala activation, and the amygdala is part of the midbrain that is very involved with our fear response in different situations, right? And so it showed the relationship between these endpoints that are really highly sensitized and have a neurological response, that have a limbic response in the brain that decrease activation, that decrease our fear and autonomic response. And these are similar points that we're stimulating, just not through needles, but through pressure. So that is one of the studies that is, goes to support why are we stimulating these particular places in the skin. And there have been several studies that somebody might say, well, maybe it's just it's not necessarily that point, but we've done sham points that don't show nearly as effective as the points that are being stimulated, and the points that are stimulated are done on the I may as well show them. The primary points are on the side of the hand, on the top of the head, at the beginning of the eyebrow, outside the eye, underneath the eye, underneath the nose, on this crease above the chin, these collarbone points, and under the arms. So these are the primary points, and they're easy to access. So they're easy to access and they're effective.
Yeah. I like citing that study when I'm introducing it to a group of people, because like I use this at the drug and alcohol rehab where I work. And what I have found is that when I now lead and introduce the topic with the science, and I talk about Harvard Medical School did a study on acupuncture and basically validated that, yes, there is something happening when you're stimulating an acupuncture point and it's doing something to your brain. And, and I talk about the MRI studies, and sometimes I show Dr. Peta Stapleton's TED Talk because she has done a lot of work with food addiction. And so then the clients see that and they're like, wow, that's amazing. Or I tell them about, some of her work. And it's wonderful that the science has been catching up, that we have technology now where we can measure differences before and after using EFT, and that we're seeing that shift is happening. Stuff is happening in the body and in the brain. And that's really wonderful. I think we're in a much stronger position now to be able to introduce people to these techniques.
I agree, especially people that are wanting that kind of scientific validation, to be able to have a grasp that, oh, okay, there's a way this happens. We're starting to see not just what we call subjective evidence, people's experience, which is very important. Let's not minimize a person's experience of their fear or phobia or their, or their emotional intensity or their shutdown, et cetera. But being able to see data and objective evidence of that is important as well.
Yes, exactly. So how did you get drawn into working more specifically with trauma? Because I would consider you a specialist at, using EFT with trauma. How did that come about?
That's interesting. I'd say severalfold. One of them is I wasn't at the beginning, and I had a friend actually that I co-teach with, Suzanne Fragile, who was is a trauma expert, and we just ended up in these fabulous conversations. And trauma is like the thing that you don't know till you know it, and then that's all there is, right? It's like Alice in the Wonderland, like you go down the rabbit hole, and then how can you not have understood the impact of it? I mean, I had my own experience of trauma growing up, and nothing compared to many others. But I remember very clearly, I was actually reading on an airplane Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, back years ago when it first came out. And I remembered reading a line about the importance of safety. Okay. So I have to pause this. I apologize.
That's okay.
There's our dog outside the door that my wife let out that it's not stop barking, and I'm going to let
And
her
you
into
won't
place.
start barking until he gets let in. No worries. We'll pause here. Can you please make the cut here?
Vivi, say hi to Adriana.
Hello,
yes.
hello.
Okay, you've now seen and heard. Yeah, I love you too. But no more barking. So once you're in here, you can go in and out. Okay.
What a cutie. My little furry one. He's bed.
I was even managing to like mute myself in between, and it was like it wasn't stopping. So
no worries.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we're good now. Okay.
I lost track of where we were though in our.
You may as well. I guess you better just probably best to start off with a question about trauma.
Yes. So I really consider you an expert in treating trauma. And so we are looking at like how you came to specialize in this. And you were telling us a little bit about your own childhood and stuff like that. And what drew you, I guess, to working with trauma with EFT?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the one thing about EFT is the beauty of EFT is EFT goes very deep very quickly. The risk of EFT is that it goes very deep very quickly. So the thing with EFT is that you might be tapping into, literally, why I don't feel comfortable with a particular person or place, or I have this fear or anxiety or whatever it is. And of course, there's my recent experience with why that's happening. And I don't know, it just doesn't feel right, or it's uncomfortable, and da-da. And there's something about EFT, and this is really, I don't have an answer for why, but it does go to the root of that very quickly, somehow tapping into the way that we do and the memories. All of a sudden, people start very quickly thinking about, you know what, this is reminding me of a time that I felt this way when I was very young. And suddenly you are finding them connecting to past experiences, memories very, very quickly with EFT, which is great for getting to the roots of things, but can also sometimes happen too fast, too quick. So it needs to be well facilitated and monitored in a trauma-informed way. So on one hand, there was the direct experience of doing EFT and seeing how quickly people started revealing deeply personal information and historical information and earlier adverse events and traumatic events, et cetera, back to childhood easily. So there's that piece. For me personally, my relationship with Suzanne Fagel, who I co-teach with many more years of trauma and somatic experiencing work and a lot of other worlds, conversations as we studied EFT together helped me to appreciate it more. And the thing about trauma, I mean, we talk about trauma now, but 8 to 10 years ago was a completely different conversation. Now it's like everybody knows what PTSD stands for. Everybody has some concept in the public of, they either know about the ACEP studies or they know about trauma in different ways. That's become much more publicly aware. I mean, it's the work of Bessel van der Kolk, and it's the work of Stephen Porges, and there's so many people out there Peter Levine that are reaching the masses now, and not just psychotherapists, for example. And I remember just from a personal experience reading Bessel's book on a plane once and talking about how important the feeling of safety was for any kind of healing. And I started to think about and go through my life and kind of recapitulate pieces of my life where I didn't feel safe for the reasons that I didn't feel safe. And I started to realize that my career was based on providing safety for people. And of course, that came because of ways that I didn't feel safe when I was young. That it was just a natural inclination to do that. And as I started to dive into deeper and deeper and deeper, the recognition and importance of what it's like in one's body to feel safe and what that meant and how that felt or how that didn't feel. And all I can say is, like, once I realized the significance of that personally, professionally, like, just worlds just started to collide, holes started to open, authors and presenters, and everywhere I looked, all there was trauma, or the idea, if I look at something through a trauma-informed lens, it explains everything. I mean, not everything, but it gives an insight into every condition, every faulty relationship, every way that people are anxious or scared or able. Or I remember reading Gabor Mate, who is now getting the recognition that he should as an author and etc. And so he had once said, it was before I was ready to hear it, trauma affects everything we do, every decision we make, down to what clothes we put on in the morning. And I remember hearing that the first time and thinking, well, that's a little bit overstated, don't you think? I mean, I like this style, until you start to realize, well, why do I wear loose clothes or tight clothes or brightly colored clothes or very dulled down clothes or so, how we experience the adversity and the trauma that we experience shapes how we see ourselves, how we see the world, what's safe to do, what's okay, what choices we make, what careers we choose. So it's so trauma is just endemic in our society, and of course, some people most worse than others. But having a trauma-informed lens in our schools, in our therapeutic whatever choices that we make, promotes or doesn't promote a feeling of safety, which then allows or doesn't allow healing to happen. So I think that trauma-informed lens really kind of doesn't end in our understanding of how we treat people and how we treat ourselves and who we are in the world. It just, yeah. So yeah, it kind of became my world.
Yeah, likewise. I mean, I kind of feel the same way these days. And one of the things that working with the tools of energy psychology, I mean, I do a lot of EFT, but I also use some different modalities also. But what it all taught me was to go for the root cause. And that really present time, whatever the present time stressor or trigger is, it pretty much always goes back to something earlier, right?
Yep.
Some original event, some, series of a trauma or a series of traumatic events, whatever.
Yep.
That it's really not even about the present time thing. If you can get back to the original stuff, I like your little assistant there in the background. He's he's monitoring. Yes. I just think getting back to the root, and what so many times in working with clients, I find that if we heal that original unresolved trauma wound, whatever it is, the core beliefs that came out of it, whatever, when we go to the root, we are able to collapse so much more of the subsequent trauma. And the person doesn't keep getting, like you said before, it changes their relationship with whatever the present time trigger is. And then they don't seem to get as activated anymore. They don't get bothered by their partner in the same way, or feel, my specialty with addiction, feel the compulsion to have to use drugs or alcohol or something to numb that pain that's still there from a million years ago.
Yeah, I mean, like Gabor said, it's like addiction isn't the problem. Actually, addiction is the answer for the person with the addiction, because it's the one thing that will relieve the suffering, albeit temporarily, of the problem. One of my colleagues that I use all the time, I love, she said, you know what? The thing ain't never the thing. And it's like, you nailed it. The thing ain't never the thing. Like, this is how it's showing up right now. But that's not where it started. And when I think that's a really important part, because we always look at the object of our anger, annoyance, or sadness, or grief, or whatever right now is valid. So let's not make it's not. However, the reason it's so big, the reason it's so large, it takes on so much space and intensity, is because there's a history behind it. And so EFT is kind of working our way back, like the Christmas lights back. The one thing that I'm cautious of, however, in training practitioners, et cetera, is the desire to get to the root can be so strong for any therapeutic practitioner that they sometimes jump there too early before the person has the capacity and the resilience to be able to work with that gently. So, as Suzanne, I try to give credit to people around me. So Suzanne says, and I love this, you know, when working with trauma, you only want to go as fast as the slowest part of you feels safe going.
Right.
So, you know, my kind of nails on a chalkboard moment is when somebody asks too early in a therapeutic relationship, so when's the first and worst time this happened to you? Like, let's go down and let's like get to it. Right. And their ability to be able to work with that safely isn't there, and they flood and they react and it's too intense and they don't come back because it was too much too quick. So I'm all for working towards getting to the root of the problem, but in a gentle, safe way where we can work on, you know, with practitioners. How is that? Okay, we know that that's an issue. How's that showing up as a problem in your life now? Because if it's not, we don't necessarily need to dig up a traumatic past just because they have one.
Correct.
If it's not showing up, I mean, especially for non-licensed practitioners more than any, because we train and teach both, is you think it's a problem, you tell me there's a history of this, but is it still a problem? How does it still affect your life now? How is that affecting the choices you make? How is it affecting the influencing the habits and the patterns that you have? So you work gently and recently and future oriented, get a therapeutic result with that first, and then start to teach them how to be able to self-regulate. So doing all these things up front and then starting to work your back, depending on your scope and depending on safety and depending on your experience and skills and all of those things, and then start to work your way back. And then ultimately, yes, getting to the root of where something started is important. Sure, just at the right place and time.
Thank you for saying that. And I really, you know, there's a few things I want to riff off of what you said, because I have taken your trainings before and have been, you know, so grateful that you do address the trained or licensed mental health professional versus a non paraprofessional, whatever we want to call it, coaches, other types of healers who don't maybe have the mental health training that those of us that are licensed or, you know, would have. I think that's really important that you make the distinctions, and you talk a lot about scope of practice and what is okay or not okay for a practitioner to do when it comes to trauma work with EFT.
It's really important, and because ultimately it's the safety of the client, isn't it? Right? And I'm not going to say I'm not a licensed mental health care provider. Have I worked with people with licensed diagnoses? With mental health diagnoses? Sure, I have, but in collaboration with somebody. I'm not the person as an unlicensed mental health care provider that's working on somebody's PTSD, and when the soldiers start crashing through the roof, I'm not the person they should be coming to, right? I'm really clear on that. However, they might be having some stress at work, and, they can't, feel comfortable asking for a raise or whatever that is that's showing up in their life that I can work with. But I'm also aware that even working on a procrastination, I can't make this change issue can bring up serious concerns, et cetera. So I want to make sure that I'm working in collaboration. I want to understand, I do refer clients away that feel like, this is bigger than my scope. But then again, I also, at the same time, the caveat, and I say this only coming from my psychotherapist colleagues and friends, many of them said, you think we have trauma training, and we didn't get any. So being licensed doesn't make one trauma-informed or trauma-trained either.
That is true, yes.
However, there are different skill sets they have about how to manage and work with them with other skills. So, the work that we're doing, trauma-informed EFT, whether you're licensed or unlicensed, should make you more skillful for working with those, and then you have to bring scope of practice and skill decisions based on that as well.
Yes. And then you had said something else that I wanted to highlight as well, because I like to do this also both in private practice and with my work at the rehab, is what I would call like the scaffolding to be able to do this deeper work is to teach people the self-regulation, the emotional self-regulation.
Sure.
And we can use EFT among other, many other techniques and modalities, to help people just calm their nervous system, right?
Yep.
Get out of, that when we talk about the 0 to 10 scale, when you're in that, I call it the red zone, when you're like 8, 9, 10, you're in this full blown fight, flight, freeze, or panic or whatever, that we need to be able to have tools to get out of that. But we also have to start, I feel like even that's a muscle to build to get to 8, 9, 10. Let's start at like 4 or 5. When your stress level is a 4 or 5 and you're just have day-to-day stressors, what about, practicing this tool as a way to calm down and then building up to being able to use that tool in a moment when your brain gets hijacked by this fear response?
Yeah, that's a great distinction. So, when I work with my clients, part of that is always, for me, it's always teaching them EFT for self-regulation at different levels. So, some of the things I hear is like, okay, when you really have a panic, start tapping. I'm sorry, when we're in that meltdown place, we're like the least likely to remember our tools.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Including me. Like, that's the last time that I'm going to have that muscle necessarily to remember what to do. So giving homework to teaching people to just silently tap as a starting place until they start to understand how to use the words more accurately and more effectively, and starting to do it proactively. Like, okay, so let's say we're working to, it's really important. Let's bring it back to you in the field of addiction. So not when they're in a full-blown attack, but at the beginning of a craving.
Yes.
Like or they know that at 10 o'clock is when that starts to really come up. Start tapping at 8 o'clock. Yeah. Okay, even though, it's only a little bit and I'm scared I'm gonna start to get this craving, in a couple hours and I won't be able to control it, right? So if we can start to develop a practice prior to being in those higher elevated states and have it be just like people have a breathing practice or a meditation practice or etc. You don't wait till you're having a panic attack to start meditating, right? It's like I roll out of the bed in the morning, I'm going to go ahead and start my practice, whatever that is. Thinking of an EFT tapping practice when you're not at that heightened state is a great idea to start building that muscle and the knowledge that, wow, I really feel better and more relaxed and more regulated afterwards. Yeah.
Well, and that's a key piece. And I learned that when I did a course with Dawson Church. It's like having the people write down their SUDS level before and after so that they can really get that, wow, I changed the way I feel. I changed the way I thought, or I'm thinking about the situation. This works. Like that to me, dealing especially with like a lot of disempowered folks. I mean, by the time I see them, they're in pretty bad shape a lot of the times. Giving them that confidence, like, wow, I can change the way I'm thinking and feeling, and I don't need the drug or whatever to do it for me, is super empowering and really goes a long way to building self-esteem. And people are more likely to keep using their tools, if you can get them that confidence in that this stuff works and I can make change.
Yep, and that's why I think it's so important early when you're working with a practitioner, working on your own, to the importance of using EFT with specific examples. The idea of tapping on all the depression in my life, and this is the problem with what I'll call the ubiquitousness of EFT, of tapping out there on YouTube and everything and every other social media. Everybody that's ever learned tapping now starts creating videos of their tapping style. And it's no longer has a clinical basis anymore. And I'm not going to say that they can't feel better, but me tapping on, even though my life is terrible and my childhood was the worst and I just can't make any decision, you may get some temporary relief, but you also may totally flood and overwhelm yourself because it's connected to so many ways in which you dislike yourself, hate yourself, etc. So, one of the real key things that we teach practitioners is the importance of specificity. It's like, okay, think of one time that you're feeling not able enough or not good enough about whatever. I can hold the possibility of that experience, of minimizing how I feel about that. And we use the analogy a lot of times in EFT world, tabletops and table legs as a useful metaphor. Like the tabletop is this issue of me not feeling good enough or smart enough or whatever enough. Use the example. Tapping on that whole tabletop of that belief, of that concept, of that meme is not likely going to collapse it or really cause any real change in it. So what we have to do is we look under the tabletop and we look at what's holding up this tabletop as something that's in my life. And there are these like legs that are connected to the ground. And if we look at those legs are the experiences that we've had that reinforce or provide the evidence for why I don't feel whatever enough about something. And so effective EFT is going to look at, all right, let's take one of those legs of one time that makes me feel that way, tap on that. And as I start to just knock down a few of those legs, it destabilizes the entire table so that the table can collapse We don't have to tap on every single time in our life that we didn't feel good enough or smart enough or whatever enough, because, you know, then we'll be in EFT therapy world forever. So there's this thing called the generalization effect that happens if we knock some of them down, then we can still collapse it without having to tap on every experience we ever had of that. And that's useful for people to know.
Yes. Yes. And more specific, the better. I think that's the hardest thing for when people are using it with words, is to really teach people how to get as specific as possible. And if they are using those scripts, the more generic scripts or videos or something, I always tell people that's fine, but change the words. If they don't fit for you, make sure you find words that fit your unique situation, experience of it.
It makes it impossible. Like somebody, if you were to ask me, oh, can we just do some tapping on this interview? And now you want me to tap with, you know, the 1,000 people that are listening right now, and their relationship to their self-esteem or whatever. One person had this experience. One person had, you know, grew up in a foster home. Somebody else had a sexual trauma, and somebody else, you know, they were the 12th kid, and everybody has completely different experiences for why they feel as how they do. So me tapping on the same thing of everybody else isn't going to be relevant. It's my personal experiences that make me feel this way about this subject. And so good EFT starting to tune into this experience, my emotions, where I feel it in my body, how I relate to that thing is going to be unique. I mean, people ask me, okay, I have a fear of flying. How long is it going to take to get over that? I'm like, I can't tell you that. I can't tell you if your fear of flying is due to your fear of loss of control, fear of death, fear of something striking out of nowhere, fear of the world isn't safe, fear of the, like, you're going to have your own relationship that manifests into this particular concern. And that can be different for every single person. So the individualism, the individual approach to each person is really what makes EFT most effective.
I agree. And that's what makes it sometimes challenging to teach in a group, because I teach an energy psychology group. And while I try my best, you know, to kind of make it, you know, the words for everyone, they're not going to be necessarily. So.
And you change it. You think, you know, we often in beginning class of like, think of something stressful that happened to you today. Something stressful, frustrating, annoying, because I don't want them to dive into something too deep. And think of that thing. Okay, you know, somebody cut you off on the road, so go ahead and tune in right now to your feeling about that. It's always the present tense mode. So right now I'm still feeling, you know, annoyed about it or whatever that is. Rate it 0 to 10. Notice if you feel it anywhere in your body, if there's a somatic element to that. And so we're all going to tap it. You're going to use your word about that thing. And that's why we try to individualize it, even when we do it in a circle or a group or online, to do it that way. So it is a challenge when working with groups, because you have to individualize it.
Exactly. Yeah. I want to shift gears a little bit and find out more about your work with matrix reimprinting. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's a fascinating world. So matrix reimprinting was developed by Carl Dawson, and Carl Dawson was one of the original EFT master group, so to speak. And he's in the UK. And what I love about matrix reimprinting, I always like origin stories. How did something form? Like, I always find it interesting that, for example, Gary Craig and Francine Shapiro both came up like in the same year with EFT and EMDR, and they both lived in the same town. They didn't know each other in Sea Ranch. And it started like at the same time. Like, how do you make that up, right? It's like these fascinating unexplainables. Matrix reimprinting came out of Carl was working with a young woman who had a younger self, you know, a younger part of her that she was working with. And he was like, can you like sense her? Can you like tune into her? And she was like, she is so real. It's like she's literally in front of me. I could reach out and I could tap on her. That's like how real she is. And he said, okay, so go ahead and do that. And so she started like tapping on her, that younger part of herself. Now, the brilliance of that moment and how it developed for me is anybody that we teach that has a big background in internal family systems or brain spotting, so many other trauma techniques replicate when we start to look at parts work or anything else. It's almost as if Carl took many of these other techniques and smush them together into this, but he didn't have background in those. It just happened organically. And yet so many people in the fields of hypnosis and hypnotherapy and IFS and constellation work, and they're like, wow, this is really familiar. So I love that. And what it is, we just trained somebody who's a medical doctor and trauma specialist, and she's just like, oh my God, this is life-changing. And knows many. She's actually Christine Gibson. Actually, she's coming out with the Modern Trauma Toolkit. It's a great book that's going to be coming out, and we were having conversations about it. And it's like I imagine a younger part of myself that was going through some sort of adverse or traumatic event. And what it does is, as I imagine this, eyes open, eyes closed, and I come into and I meet that part of them. When I'm able to work with that part of me, number one, it's creating some witnessing and distancing that allows me to not experience the intense, overwhelming emotions of the event, because I'm actually there to help that younger part of me. Mm-hmm. Okay. So in some ways, if it's a child, you can call it kind of inner child work, which is now having its debut everywhere on social media and TikTok, mm-hmm. and suddenly inner child work is everywhere again. Mm-hmm. So what we do in Matrix Reimprinting is we resource the client that we're in, so they're in a good place, so they can go help that younger part of them that was having a challenge. And we go in there and we provide some compassionate support for them so they're no longer alone. You know, a traumatic moment we often call an Uden moment. It's an unexpected and dramatic and isolating and not resourced moment in time. Okay. And suddenly that younger part of me that's going through that trauma now has me there to help them. So that helps. Then we do EFT tapping with them. Yes, in our imagination, energetically, however you want to imagine that. And that regulates them. Mm-hmm. Then we explore what decisions or beliefs or strategies were created because of what they just experienced. And, you know, that poignant focus of being able to stay regulated here to help a traumatized part of me, to regulate them, to resource them, and to then find out what decision and life strategy they made that often has lasted for decades afterwards, right? Because trauma, you know, is the gift that keeps giving. And it's really the beliefs of how we decide who we are, what we're capable of, the way the world is, the way it'll never be, all of those things. And then from our older and higher perspective, we can often provide wisdom and experience and evidence that it's not really that way. Yes, it was then. And yes, it was valid, the decision that they made about themselves or the world based on that limited experience. But it's not the total picture. Mm-hmm. But it's like what we call the echo, or that separated part that gets locked in time. Mm-hmm. And we carry those locked in time parts of us around like lenses of the glasses that we look through the world at, of the world isn't safe. And then the more we believe it isn't safe, the more evidence that we gather that that's true. So we almost start to lose the knowledge that it's a belief because it starts to feel like a fact. Mm-hmm. And what then, you know, when you start to look at the work that's the repulsion to complete, I guess I'll look at it through a spiritual lens in a sense. It's almost like there's a part of us that sees how we've limited our world and our life and who we see ourselves to be. And there's a higher part of us that says, no, you're not only that, you're this. Remember, you're this. Mm-hmm. And it will continue to provide experiences to remind us of that. But the more, now you've got your feline that's going, yes, hi, you got your assistant. Wonderful.
Yes, he's also here. He's letting me know it's almost dinner time.
Okay, got that. So, you know, it's not our fault, but there's like a higher part of us that keeps creating the opportunity to finally overcome that challenge that we didn't get to have then. But the less experience we have in overcoming, the less resources we have to overcome it again, and it repeats again and again. I mean, so many stories I've seen over the years of just crazy, you know, how people have a similar, you know, it's like you know, a good example is somebody has an alcoholic parent and they swear they'll never be around anybody that's alcoholic again. And every future relationship, despite everything that they do to not have that, turns into that. You know, there's not fault, there's not responsibility in that sense. And yet it's almost like the universe is conspiring to say, I want to give you this opportunity to finally heal this thing so you don't have to deal with this anymore. And that's the kind of anyway. So trauma does that. It's the gift that just keeps giving until. And I was going to say Carl Dawson. He has a theory. It's called the one belief theory, and it's just a theory. But I've seen it happen. Is that it's almost like we have one primary belief that we carry through a lifetime that just keeps teaching us.
Oh,
Now,
yeah.
at the beginning, it hits us over our head like a 2x4. And then as we do more healing around it, it shows up a few years later. And then so rather than thinking we have to get over it and resolve it, or we're terrible or we're bad people because we didn't resolve it, it's like, oh, there you are. There must be another element. It's like my inner guru, my inner belief guru that says, okay, why am I not feeling good enough in this circumstance? What piece from my past haven't I healed yet or resolved yet that it's still showing up?
Yeah.
And so I think it helps, just like post-traumatic resilience. People say they don't want trauma, and yet sometimes the greatest spiritual gifts we've ever had, people would say that got over cancer. It's like, no, I would not have given away that experience because it just keeps giving me. I mean, Alina, my wife, tells her story. It's really, so she developed an autoimmune condition after having a stillborn. Tried everything in the world to get over that, and it really wasn't until EFT that she did. And she'll be the first one to say, I would never change that life experience. It was terrible. I wouldn't wish it on anybody, but the post-traumatic growth that led me to the purpose of my life and the work I've done for the last 20 years came out of that.
Yeah.
So that's where I try to have the lens of, yeah, we've experienced trauma, and I'm sorry that happened. And how can we, at the pace that a person is ready, not my pace, but at their pace, be able to turn that into, the poop into soil, and to be able to then grow, your garden from that when you're ready to do that.
Yeah.
So the potential is always there. And I'm sorry that any of us have to go through it.
Yeah, I'm actually right in the middle of facilitating a workshop called From Survival to Thrival. And it's exactly looking at that. How do we get to post-traumatic growth when we have still, active trauma triggers, when we still maybe haven't established a sense of safety, when we haven't yet even acknowledged that these things have impacted us. Like there's stages.
You can't. You have to go through those stages, right?
I mean, stages of trauma healing before you can get to this post-traumatic growth. And what I love is that now we have the tools and technology to do that. And EFT is really one of these wonderful, and it sounds like matrix imprinting, reimprinting also is, these wonderful techniques that we can use as a framework to guide us toward and help a client move through that process. And I think I'm grateful every day that I get to be part of that for folks who have suffered.
Yeah, it's wonderful, and I just really, I have to acknowledge the work that you're doing, because clinically I hear all the time people that work in the addiction field that, to work with addiction and not work with trauma. I don't think I've ever worked with anybody or know anybody that is dealing with addiction that doesn't have a significant history of trauma. They're coinciding. Yeah. And that you're bringing this to that field, and that you've started to publish some papers, because I truly believe that techniques like EFT and matrix reimprinting, and they're certainly not the only ones, offer a cutting edge way to work through the kind of recidivism, not just the current relationship with it, but just as you said, it's like, it's like pulling a weed up and just like picking the leaves off.
Right.
It's like, ultimately, to really resolve this and to not have the weed keep coming back, you're going to have to dig deeper in the root, which means slower, more methodical, taking your time, getting there at a proper pace. And then, like with the matrix reimprinting and with EFT, it's like, wow, I can really think about that and it doesn't bother me. I really don't have those recurring thoughts telling me this all the time anymore. It's really weird. I'm kind of like getting used to being a new way in the world. And whatever technique does that is fine. I think that it's just that we're really seeing some of these when we start to look at it, psycho-emotional, energetic, somatic techniques that really integrate mind and body are the ones that are leading the way, especially around trauma. And because trauma kind of comes in through the body and goes out through the body, and to only deal with trauma in our thoughts my experience isn't nearly as effective.
It isn't. It's only dealing with the part of the brain that is not actually involved in the trauma, the part of the brain that was offline when the trauma occurred. So yes, that's not, and the science, like we talked about earlier, the science is showing us that that is the case. So this has been such a wonderful conversation, Craig. I really appreciated what we've been talking about. And so if people want to find out more about you, about your work, your trainings, where should
we teach trainings in person and online. EFT right now, we online about every 3 months. So EFTtappingtraining.com, you can look at the workshops and the schedule. EFT is a prerequisite to taking matrix reimprinting. EFT is a prerequisite for taking tapping out of trauma. So an EFT level 1 and 2, we're actually going, it looks like, to, we do some in person. So clinics and different agencies will bring us in to do private trainings as well. But that's the best way. And then on the website, there's a contact form, or Craig at EFTtappingtraining.com. You can reach me that way. And also, if you're looking for practitioners as well, the EFT International is one website. ACEP is another, primarily for licensed practitioners, and it's energypsych.org as well. So, and always happy to have consults or make referrals, and I enjoy that.
Wonderful. And you have a podcast also.
We do. Yeah. It's also on Apple, et cetera, iTunes. So EFT Nation. I mean, it's all things EFT. So that's our focus. It doesn't go as wide as your wonderful podcast does. So we just keep it to people that are just interested in EFT. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much for being here today. Super grateful for the work you're doing.
Thank you.
And thank you so much to who's been listening and watching this interview. If you've liked what you've heard, please do share, comment, subscribe, rate it, whatever you need to do so that we can get this information out there in the hands of more people. And that's me signing off for today. Thanks so much, Craig.
Thank you so much, Adriana. It was a pleasure.
See you next time on Kaleidoscope of Possibilities, Alternative Perspectives on Mental Health.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of Kaleidoscope of Possibilities, Alternative Perspectives on Mental Health. This has been Dr. Adriana Popescu. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe and share with others. To find out more about me, my guests, and more, please visit my website at adrianapopescu.org. See you next time.